Good afternoon. You're watching the Debka File, a weekly roundup of exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East, broadcast to you live from the heart of the region. Coming up on the program today, Assad has a message for Israel. Netanyahu warns Putin about a war with Hezbollah. Khamenei's #2 tours the Lebanon-Israel border. Putin knocked off course by 3 major setbacks. Russia joins preparations to attack Daraa. Trump scraps Tillerson's plans in Iran and Syria. Pompeo runs U.S. forces on Syrian and Iraqi fronts. Trump expands sanctions on Hezbollah and Hamas. And now to our top stories. Debka File exclusive intelligence sources report that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad used a European liaison to send a secret message to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Last week, a personal note from Assad was given to Netanyahu by a European intermediary. It stated, quote, "War is not what I'm after. All I want now is to focus on reunifying Syria and rebuilding the ruins of war. We are a sovereign nation. We shall not hand our borders over to the control of any sources other than Syria." Last week, a personal note from Assad was given to Netanyahu by a European intermediary. It stated, quote, "War is not what I'm after. All I want now is to focus on reunifying Syria and rebuilding the ruins of war. We are a sovereign nation. We shall not hand our borders over to the control of any forces other than Syria." This was understood as assurance that Hezbollah forces fighting in Syria would not be allowed to deploy on its borders with Israel. It came as a response to Israel's concerns and was sent out after Netanyahu's visit to Russian President Putin on January 29th. Netanyahu warned Putin that Israel would not stand by for the establishment of Hezbollah or Iranian troops on its northern border with Syria. Assad presumably acted on his own initiative in sending the note to Israel. The day after Netanyahu received it, a second note arrived from the Lebanese President Aoun, an ally of Hezbollah. This one was devoted to assuring Israel that there were no Iranian missile factories in Lebanon, nor would the Lebanese government allow their construction in the country. Aoun did not write the note himself, but instructed the Lebanese foreign minister, Gibran Bassil, his son-in-law, to sign it and pass it on. Bassil emphasized that if the Lebanese president believed operations by Hezbollah did not serve the country's national and security interests, he would say that directly. It was unconfirmed whether Assad and Aoun acted together to alleviate the concern of war in the region in the wake of Israel's discussion of the potential threats looming over its northern border. Netanyahu gave his answer to both presidents when he opened the weekly cabinet meeting by saying, quote, "We are not looking for war, but we'll do everything we can do to defend ourselves." With us in the studio to discuss this is Dr. Danny Orbach, senior lecturer at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
What was the purpose of Assad reassuring Israel that Syria does not want war?
If such an assurance was indeed given, then the idea is to prevent misunderstandings. It's quite clear that both sides do not want war. But such wars often break out because no side actually knows what the other wants. An enemy tends to assume that the other side plans to attack first. So there may be a situation of mutual escalation, which each side will try to attack first before the other side will attack. Therefore, if the news is true, what Assad and Aoun try to make sure Lebanon and Syria don't want war, so we can start to de-escalate the situation, to prevent such a misunderstanding.
Was Lebanese President Aoun influenced by Assad's decision, or do you think his decision was made on his own initiative?
I don't believe it was made on his own initiative. Of course, I can only assume, but it seems to me that the messages were coordinated.
How much do you think Israel can rely on these assurances?
Israel, of course, could not rely on anything besides its own force and its own intelligence, but I think it makes sense that Syria and Lebanon do not want war now. Syria has many other concerns. Lebanon, of course, will only suffer from a war. So I think we can rely on these assurances, not because we believe Assad or Aoun, but because they sit well with the situation we see on the ground.
Do you think this is a prolonged situation, or do you see this changing anytime soon?
I think it can change at any moment. The situation is so complex because what Hezbollah is trying to do is to change the rules of the game. The rules of the game are that Israel does not attack in Lebanon and Hezbollah doesn't attack Israel. But Hezbollah is trying to create capabilities for rockets which are so advanced that the danger for Israel may be intolerable. So Israel has a dilemma, whether to break the rules of the game and to attack in Lebanon, or to just sit and watch a strategic threat being developed across the border. Hezbollah will have a dilemma as well if Israel attacks. Would Hezbollah retaliate and open a war or not? So nobody can know how the other side will react. That's why the situation is so dangerous, because the basic rules of the game are shifting.
What type of immediate threat do you refer to?
I refer to rocket building capabilities in Lebanon. So the basic rules of the game are that Israel does not allow certain advanced rockets capabilities, especially very precise rockets, to be held by Hezbollah in Lebanon. But they don't bomb in Lebanon, they bomb in Syria instead. When these weapon shipments are coming from Syria to Lebanon, they are being bombed in Syria. If Hezbollah will open rocket factories in Lebanon, that means that you cannot prevent them from having such a capability. If you want to prevent them from having such a capability, you absolutely have to bomb in Lebanon. And then it's against the rules of the game. So Israel has a dilemma how to react to this immediate threat of Hezbollah's precise rockets.
That is Dr. Danny Orbach. Thank you very much for your insight today.
Thank you.
The Syrian and Lebanese presidents took action through diplomatic channels in response to the following. According to Debka File military sources, the Iranian Hezbollah project, which will construct 4 ballistic missile factories in Syria and Lebanon, is causing alarm in Israel. The assembly lines are making thousands of Iranian missiles with guidance systems for Hezbollah's expanding arsenal. Although Israeli airstrikes have destroyed some of the equipment, several underground plants are still in operation. Last Monday, Prime Minister Netanyahu discussed the issue with President Putin, saying that Israel cannot wait until the U.S. and Russia reach an agreement on Syria. Israel may have no choice but to go to war with Hezbollah in Lebanon, as well as Hezbollah units in Syria.
75 שנים אחר הגיהנום,
75 лет после этого ада,
אנחנו נחושים לבלום משטרי קנאות,
мы по-прежнему готовы настойчиво предотвратить любые попытки подобного рода структур, подобного рода идеологий.
ובראשם איראן שאומרת באופן גלוי שמטרתה להשמיד אותנו.
И в первую очередь Иран, который открыто говорит, что хочет нас уничтожить.
אף אחד מהם לא יצליח.
Никому из них это не удастся.
לא משטרי הטרור ולא שלוחיהם בתנועות הטרור. אני מבקש לומר לכם דבר אחד ודאי.
Я хочу сказать вам одну стопроцентную вещь.
לא תהיה שואה נוספת.
Не будет больше еще одного Холокоста.
תודה רבה לכם.
Большое спасибо.
On Tuesday, Putin responded by agreeing to send a high-powered Russian delegation to Jerusalem, led by Nikolai Patrushev, head of the Russian Federation Security Council. The aim of these deputy ministers would be to look into Israel's concerns regarding Iranian and Hezbollah plans for Syria. This week, additional tensions may arise surrounding the U.S.-Israeli annual military exercise called Juniper Cobra. The mission will simulate a rocket and missile attack on Israel's northern and southern borders. The U.S. has established anti-missile defense systems across many regions of Israel's borders, with the assumption that Hezbollah will attempt to aim its missiles at Israel's population centers to inflict as many casualties as possible. Iran, Hezbollah, and Syria are capable of firing 9,000 missiles simultaneously, As Israel's population centers are inadequately shielded, Israel is vulnerable to civilian casualties. At least 2 million Israelis have no protection from missile attacks. An exclusive Debka File report tells us that Ebrahim Raisi, who is tagged as a likely successor to Iran's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, toured the Lebanese-Israeli border, accompanied by Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah officers. Raisi discussed matters with Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut last Friday. Raisi challenged Rouhani in the 2017 elections. During his tour, he spoke to Hezbollah border troops, telling them that Hezbollah's influence is now in every Muslim country and encourages Palestinian fighters who are against Israel. He said, quote, "It was Hezbollah's fighting capacity alone that generated resistance in the Islamic countries." Debka File sources tell us that Raisi is the second high-profile Shiite to look at Israel's military setup along the border. In December, Qais al-Khazali, head of the pro-Iranian Iraqi militia, performed a surveillance mission on behalf of Al-Quds commander General Qasem Soleimani in order to determine the possible deployment of Hezbollah forces across Israel's northern border. Raisi's visit on Wednesday was timed to take place just a day after Netanyahu's talks with Putin. Raisi sent a message to the Kremlin that they did not plan on withdrawing its military from Syria, but was also in the process of expanding into Lebanon and confronting Israel directly. The Congress for a Syrian Dialogue that opened in Sochi on January 21st was hit by a series of setbacks. It turned into a catastrophe for Putin regarding his Syrian policy. Previously, he had hoped to move forward with his Syrian peace efforts, but was forced to halt them when the wrangling got out of control and the empty seats outnumbered the participants. Trump's decision to scrap the new policies that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has developed for Iran and Syria was another setback. The Europeans and the Russian leader had shown they were interested. They were on their way to formulating a three-way consensus on the issues when Trump was persuaded by CIA Chief Mike Pompeo to drop the new plans. After that, Moscow began to turn away from Putin's effort to forge a political transition to Syria's future. Russian forces began stepping up military operations in Syria. When Moscow tried going back to cooperating with Tehran, the Iranians and Hezbollah ignored Moscow and Washington and were making strides towards a military grip on Syria and Lebanon. After those letdowns, a Russian jet was shot down by a Syrian Islamist rebel group during an airstrike over Idlib, the most embattled part of Syria. Moscow suspected that the anti-air missile which downed the plane was supplied by Turkey. Putin saw that he was facing another foe who had once been an ally. Putin now struggles to find another strategy in his plans for Syria. On Friday, the U.S. detected Russian forces joining with Syria, Iran, and Hezbollah to prepare for an offensive against rebel-held Daraa on the Syrian-Jordanian border. This move would directly counter the Putin-Trump accord made in July, which established de-escalation zones in several regions in Syria, including Daraa.
Применение нашего оружия в Сирии убедительно показало, что по своей оснащенности российская армия сегодня одна из ведущих армий мира. Причем по ряду систем вооружения нам нет равных. Разгром хорошо оснащенных группировок террористов в Сирии продемонстрировал силу нашей армии и флота. При этом ход операции показал традиционную надежность и эффективность российского оружия. По данным Минобороны, было применено 215 современных и перспективных видов вооружений, а также большинство образцов, используемые уже сейчас в войсках военной техники. И в целом они подтвердили свои высокие характеристики.
Debka File sources report that the White House informed Tillerson's team that President Trump had opted to counter all the deals Tillerson had entered with Iran and Syria. Tillerson claims that the policies had numerous problems, including the Turkish war on the Kurds and the future of Bashar al-Assad. Several sources tell Debka File that it was Mike Pompeo who advised Trump to scrap the Tillerson plans. Pompeo is most concerned with Moscow's refusal to acknowledge the legality of a U.S. military presence in Syria. Washington insists that its military presence had full international authorization, whereas the regime which invited Russia and Iran is ruled by an illegitimate dictator. Meanwhile, Pompeo is moving ahead with the U.S. military operations in Syria. Pompeo has a range of special operation forces in Syria and Iraq. In addition, troops are based in northern and eastern Syria for performing missions on 4 fronts: Afrin and Manbij in North Syria, Deir ez-Zor in East Syria, the Iraqi-Syrian border in Anbar, and Al-Tanf in southeast Syria. In northern Syria, they offer arms to the Kurdish YPG fighters in Afrin and Manbij, who are averting cross-border Turkish army incursions. A spokesman for President Erdogan has stated that after Ankara told Washington it risks confronting Turkish forces in Syria, U.S. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster confirmed that the U.S. would no longer provide weapons to the YPG. Erdogan commanded that Turkish forces prevent Kurdish fighters from approaching the Syrian border and push east to the frontier with Iraq.
Teröristlerin bulundukları yerleri boşaltıp boşaltmamak orada bulunanların bileceği iştir. Biz öyle alavere dalavere ile değil, açıkça ilan ettiğimiz şekilde yanlarında kimin olup olmadığına bakmaksızın teröristlerin üzerine gitmeye devam edeceğiz. Kimse bizden kendi sözlerine, kendileri değer vermeyenlerin beyanlarına göre hareket etmemizi beklemesin.
Debka File military sources state that McMaster kept his promise to Ankara as well as with the Kurds. Arms were now being routed through the Kurdish militia headquarters before reaching Afrin and Manbij. The risk of a military clash between the two NATO armies is high, while American forces in the region remain on alert. Pompeo has warned Hakan Fidan, the Turkish MIT intelligence chief, that a Turkish attack on Manbij would carry the same weight as a Turkish attack on the U.S. Army. The U.S. has a war room in Turkey used to offer support to several Syrian rebel groups. Despite Ankara and Moscow urging the U.S. to shut this down, the U.S. has refused.
Yani Afrin operasyonu az önce de ifade ettim. Türkiye'nin güvenlik sorunudur en başta. İkincisi de oradaki terör örgütlerinin yaşayan, huzur içinde yaşayan Araplara, Kürtlere, Türkmenlere yaptığı zulmün sona erdirilmesidir.
In Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria, the U.S. is focused on arming its Syrian Democratic Forces and the Kurdish YPG to accomplish 2 missions. First, to fight against ISIS, east of the Euphrates River, and second, to contain the Syrian, Iranian, and Hezbollah forces, which are operating in the region. The U.S. is offering training and supplies, as well as providing artillery and air support in an attempt to withhold Assad's army and his allies from advancing to the Iraqi border.
قبل ما ندين الدولة التركية ندين روسيا، لأنه لولا الضوء الأخضر الروسي لما استطاعت تركيا محاولة اجتياح عفرين. نقول للروسي والأتراكي أيضا بأن نهايتكم سيكون على أيدي أبطالنا من قوات اليبجة واليبجة، مثلما كان نهاية داعش في مدينة كوباني.
Pompeo's third mission is the Iraqi-Syrian border in Anbar, where the U.S. does not have Kurdish fighters on the ground. The goal is to block movement of Shiite militias, including Iraqi armed forces, from Iraq into Syria. When Shiite military movements are detected or reported by local informers, they come under direct U.S. attack by the U.S. The final mission is in Al-Tanf in southeastern Syria, which is being challenged by Russian special forces, Syrian troops, and Hezbollah. This region holds the key to a safe passage from southeastern Syria into western Iraq and northern Jordan. But the U.S. is holding its ground even when attacked by airstrikes and artillery fire. Moscow is determined to gain possession of Al-Tanf and has falsely claimed that U.S. forces have turned the military base near the town into a terrorist training camp, taking on different names, such as the new Syrian army. The Trump administration's sanctions this week hit 5 Middle East terrorist targets, 2 Iranian groups, 1 Palestinian, and 2 offshoots of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. A network of companies and individuals run by the Hezbollah financier, Adam Tabaja, in the countries of Lebanon, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and Liberia, had their assets in the U.S. frozen, and Americans were prohibited from doing business with any of the 6 individuals and 7 firms involved. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin claims that Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy used to destabilize governments in the Middle East. He stated, quote, "The administration is determined to expose and disrupt Hezbollah's networks, including those across the Middle East and West Africa, used to fund their illicit operations." The Lebanese Shiite group is financed directly from Tehran, as well as a network of shell companies and smuggling projects. Washington may need to cut off its cash flow from West Africa, as much of it is derived from Shiite communities, which play a vital role in the local economies. The goal of the sanctions against Hezbollah is to get European allies to join the U.S. in increasing pressure on the group. Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department said Wednesday that it has labeled Ismail Haniyeh, senior Hamas leader, a designated terrorist. The U.S. is the first country after Israel to do so. The Trump administration has frozen all assets in the U.S. owned by the chief. Any international organizations will also be held liable for business dealings with Haniyeh. The U.S. Treasury's blacklisting of Haniyeh will be easier to implement. A State Department release has accused him of being involved in terrorist attacks against Israeli citizens and stated that Hamas is responsible for an estimated 17 American lives killed in terrorist attacks. The only outspoken opponent of this penalty was Turkey President Erdogan, a longtime champion of the Palestinian extremists. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson claims that, quote, "These designations target key terrorist groups and leaders, including two sponsored and directed by Iran, who are threatening the stability of the Middle East, undermining the peace process, and attacking our allies, Egypt and Israel. Today's sanctions are an important step in denying them the resources they need to plan and carry out their terrorist activities." The announcement by the Trump administration came shortly after the U.S. and Qatar signed a pact of cooperation against the war on terror. This agreement mandates that Qatar must seize properties and assets belonging to Haniyeh and take him into custody if he enters the country. The U.S. also blacklisted Harkat al-Sabarin, an Iranian-backed terror group in the Gaza Strip, as well as two Egyptian groups related to the Muslim Brotherhood. The two pro-Iranian groups took part in the Hamas rocket and tunnel campaign from the Gaza Strip against Israel, and two rockets were fired this past Friday and Saturday. Now to a roundup of this week's regional stories you may have missed, the news in brief. Saudi Arabia has become the 10th country to host the annual Race of Champions, held for the first time in the Middle East. Former Formula One racers David Coulthard and Juan Pablo Montoya competed alongside the sport's double champion Peter Solberg. Coulthard won his second title in the race, beating Solberg. Last month, there were a number of rallies after a dispute over female drivers was resolved. Saudi King Salman has officially allowed women to drive beginning this June. Conservation experts have begun the restoration process of Egypt's King Tut, which will be displayed at the Grand Egyptian Museum. There will be numerous artifacts, including the king's toy collection, clothes, and furniture, all of which are made of gold. The king's belongings will be on display as part of the museum's grand opening later this year. Egypt hopes the exhibit will boost the tourism industry, which has been in steady decline since the 2011 political uprising. That's it for this week's edition of the Debka File. We'll be back with you next week for exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East. Thanks for watching.